I didn't know when I moved up here that I was moving to the state with the highest incidence of sexual assault in the nation by a large margin, like 4 times higher than the next state. I did not realize that whatsoever.
4 times higher.
Mm-hmm. And in case of child sexual abuse, it's 6 times higher than the national average.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, our guest is the executive director of STAR, Keeley Olson. Keeley has dedicated her life to working with the victims of sexual assault, from her college days in Montana, through her time in Washington State, to Alaska, where she began working at STAR in 2007. STAR has been responding to the needs of the survivors of sexual assault since 1978. The organization also provides important prevention and education programs to schools and other organizations throughout Alaska. These programs seek to prevent assaults from ever happening. When STAR was founded, the acronym was Standing Together Against Rape. The agency has been trying to rebrand itself, and Keeley and I will discuss the reasons why during the episode. Keeley Olson, yes. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Let's get started by learning a little bit about you. Where are you from?
I was born and raised in north central Montana on a farm in a small town, and graduated from the University of Montana in social work. And as I was getting my bachelor's degree, part of that is doing a practicum. So I started my practicum at the Domestic Violence Assistance Center and was hired to manage the shelter before I graduated from college. So I got my start in
from the very beginning,
a domestic violence shelter environment and managing that 24/7. There were only 3 staff members, so we were on call 24/7 and sharing that between 3 of us, between holidays and nights and weekends and all that. We served Missoula and 7 surrounding counties, so it was a huge catchment area. But that was my first experience in social work was domestic violence, and I pretty much stuck with being a crime victim advocate ever since.
How did you make it to Alaska?
From Montana to Washington, and in Washington, I developed a victim advocate program for the prosecuting attorney's office in Olympia, Washington. They had a felony victim advocate, but I really developed the program so we were covering Superior Court, District Court, Juvenile Court. 2 of those staff, until very recently, were still there. I left in 2001, and they were still remaining, the folks that I hired and trained, and still loving it, but made it into a really comprehensive program. And then I stayed on as an advocate, and primarily in domestic violence and some sexual assault. I was on board of the Rape Crisis Center there, and then I also worked for the Samish Indian Nation in Anacortes, Washington, and I was a victim advocate there as well. A lot of different experiences in victim advocacy, and then I moved to Alaska in 2007. I have a lot of extended family here. My sister is here, and it was always my father's dream, I think, to live in Alaska. I'd always been looking for an opportunity to move up here. I finally got the opportunity in 2007, and I came up and I interviewed at STAR, and they had, at that time, just...
And what is STAR?
Standing Together Against Rape. Mm-hmm. And we've tried to rebrand to just go by STAR, because I think that that term can be very off-putting for some. A lot of people don't identify themselves as survivors of rape, but they may identify themselves as survivors of sexual trauma. So we're just rephrasing that, turning that around. We can't use that terminology in the schools, so we just try to get away from using that. And sexual trauma is much more encompassing. Mm-hmm. It incorporates harassment and discrimination based on sex, and it takes into consideration child sexual abuse. Mm-hmm. The term sexual violence may not incorporate everyone's experience, and yet it's still very affecting. It's still traumatic, and we want to be as inclusive as we possibly can to the people who are impacted.
I'll just offer that Star was going to be speaking to my son's 4th grade class 2 weeks ago. I think because of the snowstorms or something happened and got postponed. But he came home and he said, tomorrow we have Star speaking to us. And I said, standing together against rape. And he immediately said, what is rape? And so it led to a difficult conversation to find ways of explaining what that is in terms that were appropriate for him. So I definitely understand how that could be difficult.
We wanted to reframe it completely to sexual trauma and advocacy and response and have that be what STAR stood for. But somebody already has that name in the U.S. and it's patented, so we can't use it.
Oh, wow.
But yes, that is a leftover from its incorporation in 1978, where it was a very, very specific mission. Our mission is broadened to be more inclusive of what we know the experience to be, and so that people can see themselves seeking help through STAR and not being like, I'm not a victim of rape, so I can't go there.
You said you interviewed in 2007?
Yes. And at that time, they'd gone through a lot of, they'd lost a lot of funding. And so they were looking to hire for a number of positions, and I just fit the bill. Volunteer management and operations management and direct service advocacy, legal advocacy. And so I fit the bill for a whole lot of positions that they
I would guess that, like, with
time.
your experience from Montana through Washington, that you were the dream candidate.
I don't know about that, but they were fairly desperate. So I started as the director of programs at that time and then became the executive director in 2016. And it's been just an honor and a privilege. What a fantastic place to work. The folks are great. They do amazing work. They're so committed to the mission. And that makes all the difference in this kind of work. We have a really welcoming office environment. You've been there. You've come and toured. We have dogs in our office. We don't run a shelter. And you were asking about some of the major differences between maybe STAR and some other
Awake
social service agencies.
Awake is Abused Women's Aid in Crisis.
So Awake is a domestic violence shelter, and they run a residential program as well as several transitional housing programs and non-residential services for victims of domestic violence. And a lot of people conflate those with sexual assault and think that they're one and the same, and they really are two completely different monsters. There is some overlap, of course, with domestic violence and sexual assault, but the majority of people who are harmed by, as adults, they're harmed by acquaintances. They're harmed by maybe employers or coworkers or roommates, friends, people that they may not have that intimate relationship with. So it's definitely a crime of opportunity. And then with child abuse, that certainly is a large overlap, but not always someone that is in the family that is doing the harm. It could be other adults that have proximity to them. So there isn't as much overlap, although there is some, and we work closely with Awake, and we refer back and forth, and they will shelter our clients as needed, but it's not so often that our clients will need emergency shelter and hiding from a perpetrator that they're trying to separate from.
Because you're not taking in somebody who's left their partner, so to speak, or
they're not relying on them for paying their rent, for example. They don't have a child in common often. It's not the same. It's oftentimes we can help with emergency financial assistance to change their locks, for example, and they feel safer. So there are different safety considerations. Now, if it's an employer, for example, that's a completely different kind of safety plan and what kinds of things that we might suggest would be helpful to mitigate the harm. And
who calls you? At what point do they call you? What is the issue that's happened, and how do you assess?
The STAR crisis line is the statewide sexual assault crisis line. So anyone can call that number for information, resources, referrals, support, 24 hours a day. Often people do call the crisis line because they're interested in what their options are for reporting.
What is that number?
907-276-7273. And so that's available for anyone to call, somebody who's struggling to support someone who's been harmed, someone who has just been harmed or was harmed a decade ago, and they're still dealing with triggers and different trauma responses that they're trying to get a handle on. But if someone is calling and they've been harmed and it's within a 7-day time frame, their options are to report to law enforcement. They can have a forensic examination, have medical and advocacy there with them when they're reporting, assurance that their body is okay, treatment for any injuries, medical prophylaxis to avoid long-term bodily consequences,
STDs.
like STDs or pregnancy arising from the sexual assault, just documenting evidence of harm and providing appropriate treatment and follow-up. But we're there with them when they're reporting that with law enforcement taking their statement.
So when that person calls in and the person was a victim in the last 7 days, the person on the phone would explain, you have the option of reporting to law enforcement, and we would send someone with you as your advocate.
We would be automatically dispatched by APD, and we will meet you there. We'll be there, and someone will be with you through the entire process and then follow up with you. So we do follow up for sometimes years.
If someone decides not to report to law enforcement, can they still access resources from you guys?
Sure. Anyone over the age of 18 has the option to choose to elect not to report. But they still might want to have evidence collected. They might change their mind and they want to cover all of their bases. And that is called an anonymous victim report, where law enforcement isn't present. They aren't aware that there is an investigation going on. But the same evidence is collected, the same treatment is provided by the nurse. Advocacy is there to provide resources and really long-term care. And then they have the option. Those kits are now maintained at the crime lab in perpetuity, so they could change their mind at any time. There are some downsides with that. Of course, we want to warn them that, as evidence ages, and you have 3 crime scenes generally with any assault. You have the victim's body, you have the suspect's body, and you have the place, the location where that happened. And so you're only collecting evidence from one evidence point there. So the other 2 could be lost in the meantime. So the longer that they take to make that decision, you could lose evidence. So there are downsides to that option, but we're in the business of providing as many options for survivors as we possibly can, and making sure that they feel empowered about the choices that they are making and that they feel completely in control. And that's what the sexual assault response team does. That's the national best standard of care, is that in the case of law enforcement, advocacy, and medical all coming together in the same place so that the survivor only has to tell their story once. The evidence is collected based on what they tell, right? And so they're not going to the hospital, going over here, talking to law enforcement, going back over here to contact advocacy. And that can get really convoluted. So we try to keep it very contained, very confidential. Now, another option is that someone may know that they don't have any interest in reporting. They don't want to ever talk to law enforcement about what happened. They just want to make sure their body's okay. So another option is to just seek medical care through their preferred provider.
If someone calls and they're under the age of 18, do they get referred somewhere else?
Anyone under the age of 18 is a mandated report. And so we don't want to trick anyone. We tell everybody when they call the crisis line, I need to check your age before we go over options, because if you give me a lot of identifying information and tell me about what happened, I am going to have to report that to OCS.
The Office of Children's Services.
And law enforcement. No, the statute requires that we notify local law enforcement if there's been any allegation of assault on a child. So even though the age of consent is 16, minors go up to the age of 18. So that 16 and 17 range still fall within that mandated reporter scenario. And we take that responsibility very seriously. So we will tell people, so if a younger person is calling and they're wondering about what reporting looks like, it's a little different because they don't have those anonymous victim reporting options and just seeking medical care. What we want to tell them is what that investigation would look like.
And I'll need some clarification back when we were talking about the difference between Awake and you guys. Because it sounds like domestic violence is more Awake's domain, but with intimate partner violence, and like, especially when I think of a 17-year-old who may have been sexually assaulted by her boyfriend, or I guess like maybe a 19-year-old woman who's assaulted by her boyfriend. I mean, that you would still do all the same things with that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. I'm just making sure that I understand.
We just don't have a shelter.
Got it.
That is a safe, contained, secure environment staffed 24/7 where people can feel safer. We have other sheltering options that we can use, but we don't have that lockdown. We don't have that security. That's really Awake's territory. So we can do both domestic violence and sexual assault protective orders with folks. There's a lot of overlap there with Awake that we do. And as I said, some of our clients do have those safety concerns, and they do get shelter through Awake. And we have a memorandum of agreement with Awake to house our clients temporarily while we're still working with them and helping them. And then another agency in town that is serving some survivors is Victims for Justice. They're primarily there for what we categorize as other crimes, like homicide is what they're most well known for, and they've certainly got their work cut out for them this year. And this week alone has been really horrendous.
They were at the assembly meeting last night because they got a proclamation for Homicide Awareness Month.
Yeah. I heard that. And Suki Miller was there accepting that, and they do a great job. And again, there is some overlap in that we like to use the term as much as possible for the people that we work with as survivors. But the whole point of domestic violence and sexual assault and things is that not everyone survives. So we sometimes have families that we're working with that there's been a homicide. And so we work closely with Victims for Justice as well. In fact, they're in the same building as STAR. And so we have a really pretty good close working relationship as long as we have releases of information. Confidentiality is really paramount with victim services, but we do try to utilize any and every resource that is available. And I've heard people sometimes comment, why do we need both Awake and STAR? First of all, our work is very different in the community and what we do. Even with both services available, sometimes it's not enough for everyone. There's often unmet needs because we don't have enough funding, we don't have enough room in the shelter, for example. And really, we want people to have choices and options about the care that they're receiving as well.
Can you talk about the service that you provide in terms of facilitating with protective orders?
Sure. We can assist somebody with filling out the order, reviewing it, making sure that it seems clear, that it answers all the questions that the court will be looking to address. We can help them determine whether a domestic violence order or a sexual assault order is...
Can you explain the difference between these two?
And if there's ever been anything that would fall under a domestic violence, under that definition for the court, we would always recommend that they do a domestic violence order, just because no one wants to be describing their sexual assault in an open courtroom with offenders and just general public listening. And
the domestic violence order would not be done in that way.
And they're more common. Some people may suggest they're easier to get.
And what's the minimum criteria to make something a domestic violence as opposed to the other one? The other one's sexual assault?
Dating relationship, someone who's lived under the same roof. So whether that's family or whether that's a partner, anyone related by blood or marriage. So there are...
Like a boyfriend, would that count?
A boyfriend could count, yes.
Even if you didn't live in the same house?
Yes. So if there's been a romantic relationship, then we can use a domestic violence order and keep the sexual assault out of the court records. It's not to go out of your way to omit evidence or that sort of thing, but we have to be very cautious because when you're filing for an order that is open and available information, anyone can get it, and you don't want to have a sworn affidavit lining out the case and handing it to the defendant. So you want to be cautious that you're not providing defense with information that they don't need to have. So if it qualifies that there is a domestic relationship and they qualify for a domestic violence order, we would go that way.
Can somebody file for a domestic violence order without filing specific charges against the perpetrator?
Sure. Yeah. Completely separate process. You have civil and criminal, and you don't need to have a criminal report.
Even if the reason you're doing it is because you've been assaulted, you don't have to pursue charges for that assault. How long is a protective order typically for?
It can vary. Generally, there are short-term protective orders, and then those are the emergency ex parte orders. And then they give an opportunity for the respondent or the person who is alleged to have done harm to come to court and argue that it didn't happen. So in civil court, you have, by a preponderance of the evidence, this is more likely to have happened. Whereas in a criminal proceeding, you need a unanimous verdict, right? Or a guilty plea.
It's easier to get an order than a verdict.
It can be in some jurisdictions. They vary. The rules of evidence are the same, but how that plays out in the court varies on the players, right? And the level of training that a judge or magistrate might have in understanding red flags and what kinds of things are really domestic violence. Because just about every person who does harm is going to say, but it was self-defense, or, but she's the one who attacked me, or he's the one that attacked me. So being able to glean through some of that to look at the power and control that is in a domestic violence situation is really key for court officials in making these determinations. I
had a couple of men telling me about their friends who had been falsely accused. And when this whole thing was like, where she was always attacking him and it's the underreported crime. And I'm very suspicious of that story, that the man is the real victim in that case. But the person who was reporting it to me, obviously he's biased towards his friend.
Right.
But that person that I know who was telling me the story is a very trustworthy person whom I like. And so I was a little bit torn with this conversation where I was like, I'm going to change the topic because I don't know your friend and I don't know that specific story. And I don't think that story is typical.
Not typical. I have seen it. And definitely it is underreported. And I think that there is a level of shame of men coming forward.
Do you assist men to star?
Of course. Yes, absolutely.
And so you've had men call a hotline?
Yes. Now, predominantly they are sexually assaulted by other men. That's not the same as domestic violence. Where I've seen domestic violence, I've seen law enforcement whose guns have been used against them, threats to harm themselves or report them for domestic violence, which would mean that they would lose their job, they would lose their ability to carry a firearm, and those kinds of things. So there are instances where someone is manipulating the man and using violence against the man. So
in this case, the woman has taken the police officer's gun.
Duty weapon, and he wakes up to it being held to him.
And
as
he can't report that because he wasn't able to maintain control of his own weapon.
Right. And then if ever in a fight, this particular woman would go up and slam her face against the wall and then say, all I have to do is make a call. All I have to do is make a call and you're going to lose your job and you're not going to be able to be a cop anymore. So those kinds of things do happen for sure. There are instances where women kill their partners, right? And oftentimes you can point to a long history of that person trying to get help and the system failing them and not being able to escape and finally ending up in that scenario where they shoot their abuser. But there are other scenarios where it's the woman that is the abuser, and that really truly does happen. So we don't want to discount that. What we tend to look for are those elements of power and control and who has the power and control. If you don't have control over another or power, some way of leveraging that power. So example, like using the duty weapon against him.
You can't abuse them. It would be very difficult.
There was no way that
Right.
this person was going to physically assault the person who was law enforcement that I knew. And this was in a different state. This was not anything that he ever reported. It was something that he disclosed to me, and we did safety planning and an exit strategy and got him assistance without him ever going through any channels.
To protect his job.
To protect his job, to protect himself. You never want to let someone who has that mentality know that you're leaving or that you're separating or that you're breaking off until it's done and you're safe and you're separated, and then I'm not coming back. So we planned all of that out. But she was small, she was petite, and again, use that against him. Who is going to believe you if you come forward that this is happening? But there was a lot of drug use on her side of the equation. He was constantly tested, so she would threaten that she would put drugs and things in
his drink or food.
Exactly, so that he would pop the positive test. So there are ways that people have of manipulating situations where there's, from the outside, this super power imbalance, but it's not so much. And he was able to explain that all to me. I was like, okay, now I see it. I see where that could happen.
So it sounds like you guys are there to help the victim when they call, but there has to be some level of fact gathering on your part, because what if they both called you?
Right. That would be more of like a scenario of somebody coming into a shelter, for example. Again, we don't have that much domestic violence, and we don't see that much sexual assault where the woman is the aggressor against a man.
Right.
A woman aggresses against children. A woman aggresses against boys, teenagers.
The power leverage.
There's that power imbalance, right? There's usually not that for sexual assaults, women against men. I'm not saying that it's never happened. And some of the most horrific cases I've ever seen have been women on men. And I won't go into that because it's incredibly disturbing for the radio. But weapons used, those kinds of things, someone tied up, it's very grisly. But so I'm not saying that doesn't happen, but really when you're looking at domestic violence and you're trying to determine who is the primary aggressor, what is the history, whose house, whose name is the house in, whose name is the car in, do they both still work outside the home, but does she have to give all of her money to him? Who cares for the children?
So you can pretty quickly see who's the victim here.
It's if I leave, all the consequences are here for me. There are no consequences to him. So that makes it a little easier to see who's the primary aggressor, who has more to lose. Like, how likely is it that she's going to attack someone who has complete control over her? Unless it's the dire circumstance of she's tried to get help up
She's
until
not getting it.
It's just a case of it's you or me, and I'm not going down this way. You are. And the same can be said for same-sex relationships, is determining that power and control. Someone can have more money, work outside the home, be completely independent, and yet within the relationship has to turn over all of their money to their partner. Or there's threats to take the child and leave, and they'll never see them again. Those kinds of things help us determine who really is the aggressor and who is the victim.
So beyond assisting with sexual assault in the acute phase and helping with protective orders, what are some other services that STAR provides?
We have contracts with local therapists that provide trauma therapy to our clients. So our advocates are initially assessing people for what their needs are and determining if they say they'd like counseling. Are they ready for that? Would they like to participate in a support group where they can get support from others that are in similar situations to say, I'm not alone. I'm not going crazy. This is really how it is. Maybe they need emergency financial assistance. It was their boyfriend. Now he's been arrested and they can't pay the rent on their own anymore, and they're going to be homeless. And what can we do to help shore them up so that this emergent crisis doesn't spiral out of control and
get way worse.
ruin their lives that they knew, right? We're just trying to mitigate the harm that it causes in the long term.
Where does the money come from?
We have a variety of grants and funding sources, but we get funding from the state. We get funding from the Council on Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault that gets federal funds that are passed through CDVSA, and then they send them out to their contracted victim service programs throughout the state. We receive some money from the alcohol tax here in the Muni, which has been phenomenal for leveraging our funds. We have been flat funded by the state since 2015. While the cost of living has increased, our funding has remained the same. So the Muni is stepping in to help with some of those alcohol tax dollars. We have foundation grants that we get where we've been notified we may be getting an appropriation from Senator Murkowski. We're always writing grants and coming up with ideas of how we can get more funding. We throw fundraisers so that we have those really key unrestricted dollars that aren't tied to grants, that don't have all the constraints, so that we can be a little more fluid and flexible with how we help people, because everybody's coming to us with really complex lives, and we want to recognize that.
If somebody wanted to make a donation right now, where would they go?
To our website, which is www.staralaska.com, and there's a donate button right on the homepage.
I want to talk about, as someone who did this kind of work in Montana and this kind of work in Washington and then this type of work in Alaska, what were some of the differences that you saw? Or were there any differences, or was it pretty similar?
It seemed, I was surprised when I moved here and got more involved in the legal advocacy work that there was not more infrastructure, that there was no misdemeanor probation in this state, that there was no domestic violence treatment that was required of every offender at the misdemeanor level. The whole focus of domestic violence, particularly in the lower 48, is making misdemeanors matter and stopping violence from escalating in intensity and frequency until someone is killed, to mitigate the harm that you can to the family by holding the offender accountable. And I just don't see much of that here.
And that hasn't changed since 2007?
No. So in Washington, for example, if somebody was convicted of a misdemeanor, domestic violence, which could be anything from as simple to a slap or a shove to anything that didn't cause permanent physical injury and broken bones. So it's a wide gamut, right? I've seen awful harm done that was still considered a misdemeanor. They would be looking at up to a year in jail and up to, I believe at the time it was $5,000 fine. They could have multiple charges. They could have to serve their time if they violated any part of their misdemeanor probation. The probation officers were checking in with them regularly. And I worked as a victim advocate very closely with probation. They had a no contact order that would be in effect for up to a year. It could only be lifted if they were in a state certified domestic violence treatment program that was a huge moneymaker for the state, that you had to be a licensed counselor to be able to run these programs. You had to have a victim advocate on staff to run these programs. They had to be checking in with the survivor and make sure that the person was not violating their conditions of release. If they were, that counselor would be marching into court and asking for the court to take them back into custody, and they would. And they would sit there until they got back into compliance. If they couldn't do treatment, it wasn't just to say, I can't afford it. Surprisingly how fast they could afford it once they were locked up. Then it becomes a priority. And they couldn't just have the order lifted by asking the victim to walk into court and ask for the order to be lifted. We're not going to paint a target on the victim's back. We're going to see what he's doing. The onus, typically the onus is on the offender, not on the victim. So what is the offender doing and doing everything that we could to put the power back in the hands of the survivor to call the shots instead of having it be the other way around. And so without misdemeanor probation up here, I don't know what they do.
Do we have the same misdemeanor definition of assault?
Yeah.
In Washington, there was this very robust system for addressing people convicted of misdemeanor assault, and we don't have any of that in Alaska.
I don't know of any efforts to implement misdemeanor probation. That would incorporate some DUIs and driving offenses, reckless driving and things, and more serious misdemeanors. Some child abuse is assault in the fourth degree. So it incorporates violent crimes that fall within the misdemeanor range. And I don't know what the cost to the state would be for that, but I was just shocked and surprised that was not in place here. That there wasn't anything. Because the whole focus really is to mitigate harm sooner than later and stop that cycle from getting worse. The whole treatment, the domestic violence treatment that folks had to go through in lower 48.
Can you teach us about that? What is domestic violence treatment?
It is generally done in a group. It's done by a licensed counselor. It is reprogramming how a domestic abuser sees themselves, their partners, their place in the community, getting them to take responsibility for their actions and own up to their own actions, because abusers tend to blame everyone around them for everything that's ever happened to them and then take it out on a targeted victim or victims in the home. And a lot of it was calling them on their maladjusted belief systems, and then making sure that they were following those conditions of their release and sentencing. And if they weren't, to get them back into custody and make sure that they had, because research has shown that the only thing that really is effective in getting someone who uses violence to get their way, to change their behavior, are consequences, and not allowing that to get their way anymore. So it's just a logical progression. And if they keep getting arrested and keep going back to jail, they will try to find another way. Worst case scenario is they get sneakier. And really poorly done DV treatment just becomes like a little schoolhouse for how to batter better and how to get away with it. So that's why they had certification in Washington. They were certified. They had to have certain guidelines. And as I said, they had to have a victim advocate on staff that was keeping in touch with survivors to make sure that they were benefiting from the treatment as well. They were seeing that, well, he seems to be doing better during the custody visits. He seems to not be as reactive.
So you have some objective data that it's actually helping. What do we have here?
We have something called batterers intervention programs. They're few and far between. Not every community has them. And if your community doesn't have them, then you can't be required to go. And the state, I think, pays for it. And in Washington State, it was out of your own pocket. So I guess through an equity lens, that can be challenging for folks that were low to modest income, right? To be able to pay for the year-long treatment program. But it's the consequence and the cost associated with the crime. Because domestic violence causes a lot more cost to the economy.
With those domestic violence interventions in Washington, did they have good data to show that it was actually preventing future domestic violence?
I believe that it was. It was like a lot of places used the Duluth model, which research has indicated has been fairly effective. I think there was another model that had recently come out, and I'm not as well versed in it now since I've been out of that realm for the last 16 years. But they had, all their models that they used were based on research.
And do you believe that a domestic abuser can learn the skills to not abuse anymore?
Sure, they use them all the time. They use them at work. They use them with their friends. They use them with other people that they don't have control over. They're completely capable of not using violence with other people. But they get their needs met, and they get what they want by doing so. and targeting their partners. But yes, they generally are not going to work and assaulting their boss and their coworkers and that sort of thing, because they're highly invested in those people, thinking that they are just a gem of a person. And so that the person coming forward saying that he harmed me, that they won't be believed.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, they're completely capable of knowing how to act.
No, that's really good, because I had been thinking a moment ago about the need for something beyond maybe a group, that I guess the stereotype of the person, the man in general, who's really nice and friendly, but then loses their temper and becomes somebody completely different. Is very apologetic about it. This is sort of like anger management issue that I'm thinking like maybe they need like medication or some sort of psychiatric intervention or just a higher level of care.
And that could be recommended by a counselor doing that kind of treatment.
Mhm.
So,
But
yeah,
I'm also
there's-
thinking that those people probably don't blow up on their boss or blow up in the same way with, although at the same time, I'm thinking there are people who do blow up at the bank teller or whoever.
And that's more of an anger management.
Yeah.
But there is a strong correlation between domestic violence, road rage, mass shootings. So the people that cannot contain,
Their emotion.
that want to get control over a situation by using violence, that plays out in a lot of negative ways throughout our communities and throughout the nation, unfortunately.
Over the course of your career, do you feel things have gotten better, worse, nothing's changed, or how can you describe the trajectory of?
I think that there's a lot more understanding of the need for resources, for statutes, for laws protecting vulnerable individuals. I think the onset of like domestic violence courts, family justice centers, children's advocacy centers for investigating child abuse and neglect, that's amazing work that's been done. Accessing shelters, I think more people are aware of shelters and what they're there for and how to use them. Protective orders, you hear people talking about restraining orders all the time. Back when I started in this field, people didn't understand what they really were. There weren't a lot of laws protecting people. I was able to work in Montana and getting same-sex relationships to fall under the heading of domestic violence. That wasn't a thing. It's, so we've definitely in some respects come an awful long way. We have a lot more laws protecting people. But then you have the case just last week that was to upset the whole idea that if somebody has a protective order, that they get their guns taken away. And that went before the Supreme Court. And we were all kind of sitting on pins and needles, not sure how that would go. The Supreme Court did the right thing, and people still have to give up their weapons if they are ordered to as part of a civil proceeding with a protective order. So that is a good thing and very protective. So yeah, I think in many ways we've come a long way. And I think there are fewer stigmas in regards to sexual assault. I think that there was a lot of misinformation and kind of calculated misinformation about what sexual assault really was and what sexual trauma was. And I think there's much more understanding for that now.
Less victim blaming.
Yes, there is still victim blaming. That is oftentimes in courts. The whole defense is based on victim blaming. But there are more rules to protect against that as well than there were when I first started out in this field. There's a lot more acknowledgement of a need for prevention efforts as well.
That's what I want to talk about was prevention. Do you think, I guess the other question is, has the amount of sexual assault and domestic violence gone down, gone up, stayed pretty stable, or is it hard to say?
I didn't know when I moved up here that I was moving to the state with the highest incidence of sexual assault in the nation by a large margin, like 4 times higher than the next state. I did not realize that whatsoever.
4 times higher.
Mm-hmm. And in case of child sexual abuse, it's 6 times higher than the national average. Yeah, I didn't have that on my bingo card. But We watch the felony sex crimes report that comes out every year. That just came out. It was just published a couple weeks ago. It indicated that across Alaska, the rate of reports of sexual violence went down 7%, which is the first time that we've seen a decrease in sexual assault reports in a very long time. Now, that could be a blip on the radar. I don't know. But is there some optimism that some of our prevention efforts are really starting to pay off? Of the sex crimes that were reported, the median age of victims reporting those crimes was 16.
The median age?
Yes, across the state. So
that
I
means
think
half of them are under the age of 16.
under the age of 18.
Okay.
Under the age of 18. So, yeah, prevention is really important, and prevention is important as early as we can get it to kids. So getting into the Anchorage School District, for example, we have really targeted, focused areas of prevention where we go into schools and we talk with kids about personal body safety and body autonomy. And my body is my own from my top of my head to the tips of my toes. We talk about a safety bubble that surrounds us.
And what age do you do that training?
Pre-kindergarten through 6th grade. And we talk to kids about no one should either touch them or incite them to touch them in their private areas. And private areas, we just say areas that your swimming suit covers when you go to the beach or go to the pool. We don't get into any kind of detailed anatomy or anything like that. You don't need to. And we are available to teach parents how to talk to their kids. We've got websites. On our website, we have a couple of videos to share with kids about personal safety. So one is for our 5th graders, and other one is for like junior high and high schoolers. But it's really easy. We have coloring books that can help discuss personal safety with kiddos. So we want to get that information out to folks, because the more kids realize that some behavior like that is inappropriate, like nobody should be touching me there, or I shouldn't be touching them there at their request, that's kind of a no-no, then that is protective. And if we talk with our kids early and often about it, and it's just a comfortable conversation that we frequently have, then I have more assurance that my kiddo is going to come to me and tell me if something makes them uncomfortable. Because I'm telling them to please do so, and I will always be on their side, and nothing that they could have done would have caused me to be upset with them. So I just want to make sure that they're safe, and I want them to come and talk to me. And then if I talk with other adults about what I'm talking within my family, then even if in the mix somewhere around me there is a potential predator, it's an odd way of saying it, but they're not going to pick my kid.
Because they're going to know your kid's inoculated.
My kid has been inoculated. They know that they're going to tell. They know that they're going to come to me. And so they will pick a more vulnerable target. So we want to get that message out to parents to share this information with their kids, talk about it frequently. Don't be afraid to talk about it. We've got tools to help you so that it's not the scary conversation. It's not triggering for kiddos. It's not something that is spooky, and to recognize the risks, that it's not generally going to be somebody jumping out from behind a bush to grab your kid off the street. It's going to be somebody that you know, that you trust, who has groomed you to trust them with your children. And so to look for red flags, look for anything that is concerning. If your child suddenly doesn't want to go over to someone's house to play, and they've always done that, if they start having emotional issues that are arising, and you can put it with some proximity of them spending time with someone, then maybe be aware that it could be abuse. And a lot of people just don't want to think about it. So that puts blinders on, and then they aren't aware that can happen.
I'm wondering if there's any data to show that this type of early child intervention not only prevents the kids from being victims, but might also possibly prevent them from growing up to be abusers. And
I think so. We're not talking about it as don't be harmed. We're talking about it's not appropriate to touch someone else either.
Mm-hmm.
We want to have healthy boundaries. We want to have healthy relationships. So just helping kids recognize what's okay and what isn't, and what's healthy and what isn't, what's safe and what isn't, can go a long way. But a lot of the research is around things that led to the Safe Children's Act that is now to be implemented in all the schools. That comes from Erin's Law and Erin Marin, who came to Alaska and spoke about her own personal experience. A lot of times what we do see are disclosures of harm from kids that recognize and have an aha moment when they get this information going, oh, wait, that's not okay.
What is that law,
happening.
and what exactly does it do?
The Safe Children's Act is to present information to kids throughout the state about healthy boundaries, body autonomy, healthy relationships, the whole gamut. But primarily around child sexual abuse prevention, it is really key to sharing all of the things that I've just said. One of the things that we would really like to see is making sure that a third party, a tertiary party, is coming in to provide that information. So STAR is available. We're not getting the invitations into schools this year like we usually have. So we're being notified by some schools that their health teachers just have so much on their curricula that they don't have time to be able to invite us in. But to realize how critically important it is to have someone other than the general homeroom teacher or the teacher that they see every day delivering this message, because kids will protect adults from knowledge that they don't want them to hear. I might be more able to disclose harm to someone I don't know. I might be nervous about telling you about something that's happened to me because I don't know what you'll think of me after that. I don't know if you'll look at me differently. I don't know if you'll treat me differently or who you'll tell. So having a confidential resource like STAR coming into the schools is really helpful. And we have kids after presentations that call the crisis line. And we had a call last year that was really sweet from a mom that called. And she said, I found out that you were just in my kid's school, and I just wanted to thank you because my son told me as soon as I picked him up at school, he got in and he was like, STAR was in my class today and they were so great and they made me feel like a hero. And she said he was a victim of child sexual abuse last summer, out of state, completely unrelated. It's all going through the criminal legal system. But your discussion of how brave it is to disclose and how brave it is to look out for your friends and to tell if one of your friends is being hurt, that it really made him feel like a superhero. And she said that means all the world. He's in counseling, he's getting that, but to get that message at school in front of his whole class, and not that they know about his circumstance, but he felt pretty darn on top of the world. And that's what we want to do. We want to empower people to feel safe and heard, and loved and cared for in their community.
A really good story, and I'm really glad you're doing that work. I want to jump back in the conversation. You mentioned that domestic violence support group, or that was for the abusers, happening in Washington. Mm-hmm. I think you said it was a real moneymaker for the state, which of course perked my ears up.
I don't know if it was a moneymaker for the state, but it wasn't draining from the state. It was a moneymaker for the community. So you have people having to pay for a year-long treatment program. So it was an incentive to counselors to get certified in domestic violence treatment so they could offer this. There was an incentive to them because it was a moneymaker to them.
Gotcha. So you were able to get communities to offer this because it was
lucrative.
Yeah.
It was lucrative work for counselors. Whereas here, I think it's based on grants. Mm-hmm. That people get a grant to do it, and it's a very small, tiny amount of money.
One time, has to be reapplied for.
Yep.
It's very cumbersome.
Often connected with programs that are serving the victims in shelter, and then doing this also on the side, right? And I don't have any experience with the Batterers Intervention Program that they have here, but it doesn't seem like they have to pay for it. Mm-hmm. Doesn't seem like it's lucrative for anyone who's providing that service.
So it's like a community service. The person's going for free. They're required to go, but there's not a lot of investment from any party.
Investment is not there, and therefore they're not being held accountable for their actions. Generally, when we do something wrong, we have to pay for it. When we make mistakes, we have to pay for them. And there is generally a cost-benefit analysis that you have to weigh out as to whether you're going to do it again. And that's completely missing.
Is there anything else that you'd like to see done in our state to make it better?
There are a number of things that I'd like to see. I'd like to see a real investment in domestic violence and sexual assault, so we're not struggling for funding year after year, and we get a stopgap amount of 1 year, one-time funding to shore up what we're missing from the federal government, because we know those funds have been depleted over the last several years. So as we get less, and we're looking at a $3 to $5 million shortfall this year, and we've been very happy to have that shortfall filled. But always having it be a one-time thing, we don't know from 1 year to the next what our budget's going to be. We don't know from 1 year to the next if we're going to be able to keep programs operating, if we're going to have to lay people off. You can't really plan ahead in that kind of scenario. You can't think, I need to build onto my program and I need to offer more services when you're not sure.
Do you serve the whole state?
STAR does. We serve people throughout a lot of rural communities. We do a lot of legal advocacy. We go to the DA's meetings with clients. We go to grand jury. We go to court appearances and things.
Do you send people in person to go with people in Bethel, Nome?
No, but say Dillingham, their cases are here.
Gotcha.
So the survivor has to come here.
Gotcha.
For the court proceedings. And so we serve those people who are traveling from other areas. And through the statewide sexual assault crisis line, we're dealing with people from all over the state with all kinds of questions. Of course, we're always trying to connect them to the closest resource near them. There are many programs throughout the state. They're usually dual domestic violence and sexual assault programs. Anchorage is the only one that has the luxury of a domestic violence program and one that's dedicated solely to sexual trauma. And I think so much comes from that we can be leaders in the state because we do a lot of that work. We have contracts with NOAA. We have contracts with the National Park Service for anti-discrimination trainings and those kinds of things. But we served, I think, 56 rural communities last year. We also do some of our prevention education. We've been to the Kodiak School District where we go in person. We've had some requests maybe for other school districts around the state that would like to have us come in.
This is a little off topic, and I know we're towards the end of our time, but I know of a case where a woman filed for a protective order against her husband, whom she was separated from. But because she had children, it made it very complicated because there was required visitation. I don't know if that's a gap in our system or something that we need like better coordination on.
It's a gap everywhere. It really is. Oftentimes, we just don't have enough legal representation for survivors as well. We know that really evens out the playing field as far as helping with that power differential. It's just very difficult to find. There are a number of pro bono attorneys and low bono attorneys working throughout the state that take on a lot of cases for folks. And we have resources like the ANDVSA Legal Advocacy Program, and ANJC has a legal advocacy program. But often the hardest cases are family law cases. Divorce and family law, they can take years. It's a huge investment of time, and a lot of attorneys just don't have the time for it, especially at a very reduced rate. If we could get more funding for legal services, that could really make a huge difference, because without representation, even sometimes with representation, it can be really challenging. You can ask for supervised visitation, but oftentimes they're going to have the offender's mom doing the supervision, and that's not very conducive to help. There could be tertiary supervised visitation centers where one person drops off a child on this side of the building, somebody comes in this way, They visit, they're supervised. The two parties never see one another. It doesn't escalate any kind of violence between them. The child is assured safety. So a supervised child visitation center would
That
be
is
a
not
great idea.
happening with this
No.
particular woman.
And it's a huge need everywhere. It's not often available, even in Washington
Right,
or Montana,
right,
where I
right.
worked before.
Keeley Olson, thanks so much for being on the show today. Will you remind us of your website one more time?
Sure. It is staralaska.com.
And the phone number and this is the 24/7 phone number if you're the victim of sexual assault or have questions about,
Or a friend or a nurse or a doctor, those kinds of things. Anybody can call the line for assistance. That's 907-276-7273.
Thank you so much.
This coming Tuesday is Giving Tuesday. Please consider making a donation to STAR. I have a link to their website in the show notes. Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email eastanchoragebookclub@gmail.com.